That's enough for now. I've run over and my plane is literally about to leave the gate.
Tonight.
Yeah, I'm back. My plane got lost. So I guess it's time for part 2. Here's a recap in 10 words or less of part 1. William Willett introduced daylight saving to the UK and most people liked it but some didn't, especially farmers. Yeah, that should do it. Time for the US to have a go at DST. Cast your mind back to 1909, a year famous for the first aeronautical death, RIP Eugene. Also, the date that a Cincinnati businessman, E.H. Murdoch, visited England, where he heard the whispers of revolution. The Time Revolution. DST. He heard about DST is what I'm trying to say, and Murdoch thought, wow, that's a bit of me, love that, let's get this back home now. So, having returned to the US, Murdoch set up a group called the National Daylight Association of Cincinnati in support of daylight saving. If only they could get a meeting with the president. And they could, and did, because it was 1909 and you could presumably just walk into the Oval Office. But which president? It's Taft, the heaviest and first one to own a car, but last one to own a cow. Billy T was responsive to the idea of DST but recommended the group pursue the idea at a local level instead. Representative Andrew Peters introduced a DST bill in Congress a week later, but it was shot down very quickly, and things went quiet on the daylight saving front for a few years in the US. But then, World War I, like in Europe, made everybody really horny for DST. 2 weeks after the US declared war on Germany in 1917, a bill was drafted by the National Daylight Saving Association to, quote, save daylight. DST was really growing in popularity though. They'd seen the effects it had in Europe, so why not import some of that Euro magic to the States? But I know what you're thinking. Where does Colgate stand on this all? I have a sordid past with Colgate. Ever since I was 13, when I was cleaning my teeth and some toothpastey spit got on my crotch by accident without me realising. At school, somebody noticed and I was called Elliot Cum for a month, a nickname which I critiqued at the time for lack of creativity but have now grown into. Anyway, the president of Colgate, Sidney Colgate, he knew it was named after a guy. He brought a businessman's perspective to DST. His toothpaste, soap and perfume company had already trialled DST on their own. Sorry, perfume? Colgate, the guy, said one of his department heads hadn't taken a holiday the year that they had trialled DST, and when Colgate pointed this out, the head said, I do not feel as if I need any vacation. Every day during the summer months was a short vacation, and I have never been in better health. Which just sounds like capitalist propaganda to me, but whatever. Some people, like the trainmen, were not happy with the proposal. Trains rely on a very carefully crafted schedule, and adding time shifts to that creates issues. For example, across the American rail network, there would be 1,698,818 clocks that would need changing. How was this number calculated? Don't worry about it, I'm sure it wasn't exaggerated to prove a point. However, incorrect timings could potentially cause a crash. D.C. Stewart of the American Railway Association said, if there should be one man on any railroad who misinterprets his instruction, or if he makes a mistake in changing his watch, there is nothing that stands between that man and a wreck. Luckily, daylight saving has never killed anyone, so, D.C. Stewart, I name you a liar and a coward posthumously. I assume you're dead. What's that tiny man that lives inside my ear? Okay, so it turns out I owe D.C. Stewart a huge apology. A bunch of people have been killed by daylight saving. Like, so many. But for it to kill people, we need to implement it first. Stay with me. Senator Kellogg, no relation, asked D.C. Stewart what time of day fewest trains were running, and he replied 2 a.m. So that's what time the clocks were chosen to change, and Stewart was satisfied. Recreation. This plan will end in death and destruction. Mark my words. There are just too many trains. Yeah, but what if we did it when there were no trains? Yeah, alright. The Senate passed their DST bill on June 27, 1917, but it would not be signed into law until the following year with the Standard Time Act by President Woodrow Wilson, who was a big fan of the idea. He also kept a flock of sheep on the White House lawn. The bill wasn't without opposition. The farmers, like the ones in the UK, objected. Otis Wingo, congressman for Arkansas, said, "A majority of the men who advocate this character of legislation have not seen the sunrise in 20 years. This bill is for the relief of the slackers of the nation who are too lazy to get up early." Otis, those men that you're speaking of were just drafted into a war. Do you think you get a lazy Sunday lie-in on the Western Front? Maybe a mufti day on Fridays, I don't know. Daylight saving came into effect nationwide at 2 a.m. on the 31st of March 1918. There was more resistance than there had been in the UK, with some people insisting on sticking to old time, which is very funny and one of those things that seems like a protest but is actually causing them much more hassle. It would mean that they would show up an hour early to absolutely everything out of pure spite, which, to be fair, I do love. DST began increasing societal divisions. It became a city elites versus the rural working class. Good to know that kind of thing doesn't happen anymore. The rural kickback to DST was mainly driven by farmers who still hated it, as well as religious fundamentalists for some reason. Congressman Ezekiel Candler Jr. demanded, "Repeal the law and have the clocks proclaim God's time and tell the truth!" Ezekiel, could you just point me in the direction of a biblically accurate clock? Thank you. Neither side was really talking to each other. A lot of these issues could have been solved if the two warring factions just sat down and talked. By 1919, over 20 bills were introduced to Congress to repeal the daylight saving law, and after vetoing to repeal the DST law twice, President Wilson was overruled by Congress later that year. Daylight saving in the United States was over. When this happened, one of the advocates for the original 1918 bill said, "This means that the daylight saving is through forever. I cannot understand how people allowed it to be defeated. I doubt whether any Congress will ever pass it again." Yeah, I wish, because what happens next in regards to DST in the US broke my brain. Because the bill had been repealed, it was left to each individual city or state to determine whether or not to keep DST, which is maybe the worst idea the US has ever had. New York and Massachusetts kept DST, and the rest of the country didn't. 2 New York residents weren't happy about this though. Well, there was probably more than 2, but the book I'm getting this information from didn't run through what each of the 5 million residents of New York at the time thought. Let's just concentrate on William Bell and Jacob Rosenbasser. The 2 were convicted murderers and had been condemned to death by the electric chair, a method I would personally not be into, mostly due to the haircut they give you before. When the 2 awoke on April 30th, they found the clocks had gone forward, essentially costing them an hour of their lives they wouldn't be getting back. Bell protested, saying it was unfair and that "I don't like to lose an hour," lobbying for a stay of execution. He was subsequently electrocuted to death, along with Rosenbasser. The federal government only had control over DST in one location, the District of Columbia, where Washington, D.C. is. Instead of keeping DST, the President Warren G. Harding decided on a different approach. Presumably after getting very drunk or receiving a traumatic brain injury, he proposed, "Instead of moving the clocks forward, how about we move the people forward?" So, his idea was, instead of starting work at 9, how about people start work at 8 and finish an hour early? Only government employees were ordered to follow this schedule, for everyone else it was voluntary. And it was a huge success! Only joking, it dissolved into chaos nearly immediately and was repealed a month early. The DST movement wasn't dead, however, and was somehow growing. By 1932, 15 states observed DST in some form or another, which works out at 35 million people, and by the late 1930s, a quarter of the US population followed it. Internationally, things were also a bit of a mess. The League of Nations, which was like the Avengers of 1930s countries, recommended that all governments adopted DST with the dates being the same. This would allow cross-border transport to run smoother and trade to flow more efficiently. Everybody ignored this advice and continued doing their own thing. But the debate wasn't over. Due to it being the 1930s, there wasn't really anything better to do than hash out DST. Really let the nations get into the minutiae of it. And the great thing about the 1930s, the world had never been closer, internationally speaking. So it really was the perfect time to do it. Well, except for, well, you know how at the cinema these days, all there seems to be on are remakes and sequels. Well, the exact same thing was happening in the 30s, except with global conflict. Britain. Britain, still turned on about how good DST had worked out, decided to chase that high once more and went a bit nuts. 1 month after they declared war on Germany, Britain decided to amend the start of British summertime to the most logical month, February. Germany reintroduced Summerzeit for the first summer of the war, starting on April 1st, 1940. Britain, with our characteristically weird need to show off over strange shit, outdid them and decided to extend summertime throughout the entire year, giving Britain year-round DST. And then, in the spring of 1941, they moved the clocks forward another hour for the summer, creating double summertime until the end of the war. So, how did all of this go down in the country that's most famous for complaining about stuff? Really well, actually. We're very sun-starved here, so it turns out we'll take whatever we can get. Speaking of which, it's getting a little bit hot, and I'm going to make my jacket disappear with the power of magic. Well, that's not magic. This is just another shot with a transition. Unbelievable. It's lazy, is what it is. It's lazy, and I'm disappointed. What were you saying? Wait, you're telling me I'm not talking to anybody right now? I'm sat in my room alone reading off an auto cue, which I can't deviate from at all, no matter how hard I try. All of my words have been dictated ahead of time and I only have the illusion of free will? Even my ad-libs are dictated? Even this? Wow. Well, this has really shaken my view on reality as a whole to its very foundations. I guess I'll just keep talking about daylight saving and schedule some time to worry about the existential implications of this later. Countries all over the globe began adopting DST again. Even though the US hadn't joined the war, and potentially never will, President Roosevelt proposed a daylight saving bill to save on energy domestically. He did what no other president before him had thought to do. Speak to the other side. He appealed to the governors of the southern states to enact DST by local statute. And they did. The US joined the war in 1941. Oh, I guess I was wrong earlier. And the next year, Congress passed a bill for DST, but with the stipulation that it would cease effect 6 months after the war ended. It became known as wartime, which compared to British double summer time is a slightly cooler name, I guess. And then the war ended, and the US got rid of DST again. Britain got rid of double summertime, and things went back to the way they were. Except for, you know, the destiny of the planet changing due to the advent of nuclear weapons, as well as global geopolitics changing forever. Oh, and more relevantly for this, daylight saving was about to go nuts again. I'm not lying, it's true, man. Like the president in 1947, Harry S. Truman. Congrats, it's the worst joke of the show, the only way is up from here. Truman was getting really annoyed at the mismatch of various states observing DST. At this time, just under half of the US population was following it. Truman said, "We now get an hour's difference in cities that adjoin each other. If there is a daylight saving program, it should be a national program, not a local one." I know what you're thinking about Iowa. What's happening in Iowa? Well, over the course of a single year, there were 23 different combinations of start and end dates for daylight saving. Not only were individual states deciding whether to follow daylight saving, but individual towns and districts were, and nobody was talking to each other. Like the key to every successful relationship, communication is paramount. Things don't work when you bottle things up, break up over text after 10 months of a seemingly loving relationship, and then ghost the other person. For example. You even get to the point where individual boroughs in the same town had different time zones, which is exactly what happened in St. Paul, Minneapolis. The interstate bus from Steubenville, Ohio to Moundsville, West Virginia went through 7 different time zones. This trip took less than an hour, going just 35 miles. If the passengers on board wanted to, they would have had to change their watches every 8 minutes. I mean, I say if they wanted to. They could have. You could do it, right now. No one's stopping you. Just fiddle that little knob. Train companies were publishing 2 lots of timetables, one for standard time and one for DST. This, somehow, was costing them the equivalent of $18 million now. There haven't been enough, if any, Daryl's in this episode. Let's bring one in. Daryl Hardesty and his wife are returning home to Indiana after visiting their daughter in North Carolina. They arrived at the airport only to find that their plane had taken off without them. They'd forgotten about daylight savings and had missed their flight by an hour. They got on another plane which got them back to Indiana at 2 a.m. before they went straight to bed. In the morning they called Mrs. Hardesty's sister, who was slightly confused because she'd assumed that the couple had perished in a plane crash the day before. The plane they were supposed to get on had collided with another one, killing everybody on board. The family, hearing the news and not knowing about the scheduling mix-up, believed the worst until that phone call the next day. In 1963, the Senate held talks to discuss legislation for DST uniformity, only 45 years after this whole mess had started. At this point, daylight saving either began on April the 24th, 25th, 26th, 27th, 28th, 30th, or May 1st, 3rd, 14th, 15th, 17th, 18th, 24th, 25th, 29th, 30th, and 31st, or June 1st and 7th, depending where you lived. Even though some senators were wary of supporting DST as it would invoke the wrath of the farmers, even the farmers were tired of this whole clusterfuck. However, 1964 arrived, due to the passage of time, and there was still no federal legislation on DST uniformity. 14 different bills were considered, but none came to a vote in the House. Even though the farmers were now on board, not everybody was. Legislator for Iowa, John Schmidhauser, said, "I cannot support uniformity at the cost of the many young schoolchildren who will stand cold and lonely awaiting their school bus on rural roads." Which was an odd thing to say. In April of 1966, finally, a bill standardizing DST was brought to a vote in Congress. It called for daylight saving to last from the final Sunday in April to the last Sunday in October. It passed the House 281 votes to 91. Current president and man who tried to get rid of kidney stones by asking an aide to drive him over bumpy roads, Lyndon B. Johnson, signed the Uniform Time Act into law. But it included a provision that any state could exempt itself by passing a state law, because anything about making this stupid, bloody subject simple was apparently beyond anybody involved. Most states accepted the law with no issues. However, in more rural ones, there was some kickback. State Senator Bobby Rowan proclaimed, "Not since biblical times has there been a man who could change sunrise and sunset, but the bureaucrats are attempting to do it." Does this man think that if I fiddle around with the hands of a clock enough, I could create a state of complete darkness? I mean, I'm going to do that after the video just to check. So if the light goes out from the sky whilst you're watching this, soz. Hawaii exempts itself because it's very close to the equator, so DST would have very little effect there. South Dakota and Colorado voted for DST in a referendum, which, being British, I can safely say are always a great idea. Michigan also held a referendum. The result was to reject DST by just 490 votes, out of 3 million cast. Arizona opted out, as did Indiana. Let's bring war back into the mix. This time it's the Vietnam War, and the way men were drafted was by essentially a birthday lottery. A date was selected at random, and if you were born on that day, you were in for an all-expense-paid trip to Vietnam with a side order of horrendous PTSD and the chance to destabilise a nation that really the US should have had nothing to do with, as well as a 1 in 10 chance of being a casualty in said war. This didn't sound that appealing to Chester Brinton. His birth date of August 12th was chosen and he was told to report for duty. Chester was born at 12:03 a.m. Because of the whole mess of time zones, he managed to claim he was actually born at 11:03 p.m. the previous day, which had a much lower conscription number. He won this argument in court, avoided being drafted, and this loophole was subsequently closed. All in all, DST was fairly popular and accepted in the US. It would be a real shame if somebody came along and messed it all up again, wouldn't it? The Yom Kippur War of 1973 led to an oil crisis. An embargo was put in place by some of the oil-producing Middle Eastern nations as retaliation for the US getting involved. The president at the time, all-round honest bloke from my limited research into him, Richard Nixon, was faced with, in his words, the most acute shortage of energy since World War II. Facing a shortage of 3 million barrels of oil per day, he urged Congress to pass a bill that would implement DST all year round. 6 weeks after the oil embargo started, a year-round DST bill passed the House by 311 votes to 88, called the Emergency DST Energy Conservation Act, for a trial period of 2 years. It came into effect the following year on January 6th, easily the most controversial thing to ever happen on that date. To be honest, the act was probably the right thing to do. It's cheap, it's free, and the only thing it involved was cooperation. Even 6-year-old Alan Cope was a fan, and was quoted as saying, "I like it because it will give me more time to learn to ride my bike." Good for you, Alan. Moving the whole of the US to year-round DST wasn't without tragedy, and this is where things stopped being fun for a bit. It meant that the mornings were darker for longer, meaning that many children were going to school in darkness. That legislator earlier might have actually had a point, because there were fatal accidents involving children in Virginia, Ohio, Louisiana, Pennsylvania, California, Illinois, and Florida within weeks of the bill passing. Public opinion had been at 76% approval, however, that dropped down to 49% very quickly. The thing is, fatal accidents involving children actually dropped in the evenings because now it was lighter, meaning that the accident rate pretty much stayed the same. But, to be clear, the acceptable amount of accidents should and could have been zero with proper planning and better information. And we're back in the fun zone! The embargo ended in 1974, but prices were still high. A proposal was proposed: get rid of DST for the 4 darkest months, November to February, and it was signed into law by President Gerald Ford. Hey, what happened to the other guy? That's strange. The Department of Transportation found that there was a decrease by 0.7% of fatal motor vehicle accidents from March to April, compared to with standard time. That works out at 50 lives saved, which doesn't sound like very much, but have you ever seen 50 people die? It really knocks you off your rhythm. More daylight also leads to a decrease in crime, which didn't help Nixon, but did help society as a whole. Violent crime was reduced by over 10% in Washington, D.C. alone during periods of DST. The Emergency Daylight Saving Act expired in 1975, and the US reverted to the Uniform Time Act of before. So we're good? Am I done? Can I draw a conclusion on what should be done about DST? Right. In 1984, the corporations decided to get involved. Led by lobbyist James Benfield, the Daylight Saving Time Coalition was formed with the aim of extending DST. It was backed by 7-Eleven and McDonald's, who both believed that a lighter evening meant people would be more likely to shop/eat for longer. Fortune calculated that a 7-week extension would lead to an additional $30 million for 7-Eleven and a further $100 million for the golf industry. Candy manufacturers also got involved with the specific goal of extending DST to include Halloween, because lighter evenings meant kids would trick or treat for longer, meaning more sales of candy. President Ronald Reagan supported whatever big business was saying about anything, to be honest, so of course was in support of the coalition. The most popular solution was to establish DST from the first Sunday in April to the first Sunday in November, lengthening it by 3 weeks in the spring and 1 week in the autumn. Obviously, there was pushback from the agricultural industry as well as religious fundamentalists, who thought changing the clock was against God or something. I don't understand why they keep viewing the clock as if it's some holy artifact. If you described how a mechanical clock worked to Jesus, he would have a seizure. The proposals were put into a bill, and the last week in November extension was dropped, much to the sadness of the candy manufacturers. It was signed into law in 1986 in the aptly titled Federal Fire Prevention and Control Act. It was added to an existing bill as to sneak through and avoid as much scrutiny, a practice that doesn't seem right to me, but you do you. We're pretty much done with the history, but we still have time for one final cameo. It's Bush! Who doesn't like a bit of bush? Well, most of us when it's the George variety. Due to actions beyond anyone's control, oil prices were soaring. Oh, right, it wasn't beyond anyone's control, it was the direct consequences of the president's actions. To help ease prices, the Energy Policy Act of 2005 was signed into law on August 8th. It extended DST so that it began on the second Sunday in March at 2 am and ends on the first Sunday in November at 2 am. Well done, candy companies, you did it. Have a lollipop. Currently, more than 70 countries follow daylight saving. In 1996, all member countries of the EU adopted the same daylight saving period, from the last Sunday in March to the last Sunday in October. This was out of sync with the UK for many years. However, in 2002, Parliament permanently set Britain's summertime to match the EU's, showing our characteristic love and undying support for the trading bloc. Even Antarctica observes daylight saving, despite not having days for half the year. And that's it. That's the history until somebody comes along and messes everything up again. I am frankly astounded that given the uncertainties with global politics recently and oil prices rising, that nobody decided to implement DST year-round again. But they didn't, and I don't know if I'm happy or sad about that. I don't even know where I stand on this anymore. This has broken me. But if you really twisted my arm, what should we do about it? It's tough. On the one hand, a bit more light in the evenings is lovely, especially if you're marooned on the same sun-starved isles I am. On the other hand, daylight savings has probably killed more people than every serial killer combined. Inside all of us are two clocks. The first is our circadian rhythm, our natural inbuilt clock, which wakes us up, lets us know when to eat, when to fill urges of any kind really. Shout out your favourite urge below. The second clock is the mechanical one, and whilst this one technically isn't inside you, yet, it does influence your biology in a lot of ways. The two clocks aren't synced very well at all, especially because your body clock, your circadian rhythm, is different from anybody else's. It depends on practically every factor that there is: where you live, how much electric lighting you use, what you eat, if you're in a coma, medically induced or otherwise. The list is endless. However, what your circadian rhythm loves is habit. The best way we can sync the two clocks is with habit. Changing time twice a year really breaks a very important habit. It creates what's been dubbed social jet lag, which in essence is just regular jet lag, but with no jets, which was the coolest part. It messes with your sleep schedule, throws you off your whole routine, and can create a litany of detrimental health effects. According to a Swedish study, in the 3 days following DST, you have a 6.7% greater risk of having a heart attack. Oh, by the way, Sweden, as a nation, whilst I have you here, please sort Malmo out. I went on a day trip there and there is nothing in that town. I took this photo, which I'm very happy with, but other than that, I was disappointed. Maybe that's just how Swedish tourism works, though. You hate it at first, but then you grow to love it. Actually, maybe that just applies to the capital city, Stockholm. It's the second worst joke of the show! We have fun. Heart attacks aren't though. According to a study by the Open Heart Journal in 2014, you're 24% more likely to have a heart attack on the Monday succeeding DST than on any other day. But you're 21% less likely to have a heart attack on the Tuesday that it ends. I'm not really sure why that stat was laid out like a riddle. Maybe a sphinx wrote it. But the gist is, you are much more likely to have a heart attack after DST, the night you lose an hour's sleep, whereas when it ends, you're less likely to have a heart attack by the same amount. Gonna get rid of this for continuity, or maybe I should just keep it on. I'm gonna keep it on. In 2017, I'm not gonna keep it on. In 2017, the American Economic Journal estimated that the transition into DST caused over 30 deaths in the US alone, mostly due to accidents caused by sleep deprivation. But daylight saving is helping with the economy, right? And that definitely matters more than human life, Boris. Well, if you were listening at the start, I clearly said save questions until the end, so thank you so much for derailing me. I hope it was worth it. See? It just moves on without me. Ugh. The same journal I was quoting on before estimated the economic impact of DST as well as a social cost for the 30 deaths at, and you're not going to believe this, $275 million annually. And that's not even mentioning traffic. Let's do it. Let's mention traffic. It's time to mention traffic. Traffic. We touched on the positives of DST to traffic earlier with the 0.7% less fatal accidents stat earlier, so let's switch it up. Time to mention traffic!
Traffic after dark.
Not like that. Well, I guess. Whilst it's estimated that there's a 3 to 4% drop in traffic fatalities during times of DST, in the weeks following it being lifted, accidents increased to 11%. A database made up of 732,835 fatal motor vehicle accidents ranging from 1996 to 2017 found a 6% increase in the weeks following the spring transition, but negligible increase at the other end of the year. When William Willett set out to implement DST, he wasn't driven by financial incentives. Yes, he used that in arguments, but that was mostly just to win them. To him, it was never about saving the government money. It was genuinely because he believed people would live better, more fulfilling lives if there was more light in the evenings. And I think he was right. But pretty quickly it was twisted into a money-saving scheme. That's what every single one of these changes to DST has been about. And that's not a bad thing either. As somebody who's critical of capitalism but also recognises that we're kind of trapped in this prison of our own making for the time being, saving money in times of crisis is very important, because when there's a squeeze on government spending, it's the most vulnerable in society that feel it first. Always. And changing the time slightly to save on energy costs is a very cheap, easy solution that also happens to be incredibly irritating. It's tricky because I'd love to say get rid of DST. I have spent at this point months, possibly years, researching this god-awful subject, something to do between my regular crying sessions brought about from my fairly recent breakup. It was supposed to be a 5-minute video, an introduction to rebellion type thing, a funny rant at this minuscule subject that nobody likes but also nobody actively hates. I now actively hate it. But the thing is, I get it. I support instances in the past where DST has been implemented. I've seen the struggle it's been to get us to this point. Do we really want to mess it all up again? However, just because you've spent a lot of time making a mistake doesn't mean you owe it to the mistake to continue. At the end of the day, it's still a mistake. And maybe there's a way which learns from the past to look to the future. How about this spring we move the clock forward and just leave it there? Summertime all year round. And then we stop. Willett can have his nice summer evenings, but we sidestep the changing of the clocks from that point on. Winter mornings will be dark, but they're dark anyway. Look, it's not a great solution, but it cuts out the health and traffic impacts whilst maintaining the economic benefits. Or we could just go back to standard time all year round, I guess, and just have shorter working days. Or a 4-day working week. We designed a world that we can't live in correctly. That's how genius our species is. If something as simple as changing the clock by an hour leads to the deaths of thousands of people, then we've messed up. It started off as a good idea. It just got a bit rough at the end. And the middle. And the beginning, if we're being fair. It was never a good idea, is the point I'm trying to make. Just good intentioned. Really, there is no solution. At least not for everyone. The US especially is just too big for a sweeping generalization on DST. However, that leads to state-by-state decisions on whether to keep it or not, which in turn leads to the aforementioned disaster. The Earth, by nature of being a sphere, has different seasons and days and times depending where you are. A solution to one country or state's DST issues would lead to issues in another. It's too late to go back. The most sensible solution would have been to never implement it at all. But you know what they say about hindsight? It's 2020. Oh God, no. But I did say at the start we'd come up with a permanent solution on what should be done. So, here we go. We move the clock forward each and every spring, but we don't move it back again in autumn. Soon the hours of the clock will be completely unrecognisable, and we can shed the shackles that bind us to time and live free in unbridled hedonistic pleasure for all eternity. You happy? Because I'm not. In 1927, a memorial was built for William Willett in his native Petts Wood. They built it in the middle of a forest, the place in nature which receives the least amount of sunlight barring maybe a cave. In 1933, the Daylight Inn was opened, also in Petts Wood. A wax figure was made for him in Madame Tussauds. For a man who had such a profound impact on the world just over 100 years ago, it's amazing, and a little depressing, how quickly we forget about people like this. How many of you genuinely knew his name? I didn't. As somebody who did not support daylight saving and set out to make this video as a hit piece against it, I have enormous respect for William Willett. I love it when somebody's obsessed with something really, really niche and they make it their whole reason to be on this earth. Sometimes, those people, like William Willett, those are the people that change the world. And I gotta say, a bit more sun in the evening is nice. And that's the end. Wow, that was even sexier than I thought it was going to be. Leave a like if you agree, and a comment down below listing any one of the 5 continuity errors I left in here on purpose, just to see who's paying attention. Subscribe for a video on either the Titanic or Married at First Sight Australia next. Sources in the description, and a special shout out to the book Seize the Day by David Perrow, for which a lot of this information came. See you, beautiful devils, next time.